All right, in this episode, we're going to do a little overview of the century of what is often collectively called the Indian Wars, which are really several dozen small wars in different decades against different tribes with different unique stories and the same tragic outcomes. Several of those wars are represented in those thin little bars that you see at the bottom of this timeline. You can see sometimes they're very short and sometimes they go on for a few years. Sometimes there's more than one happening at the same time in a different place. And obviously, each tribe and each region and each war probably deserves its own series. But this is really going to be an overview where we're not aiming for extreme detail. We're just doing a summary. So, as you've heard me say a few times now, Native Americans did not live in what we would recognize as like nations with defined borders like you see on this oversimplified map. Something like this is much more accurate. Tribes are often overlapping and sharing territory. And the tribes are often divided into sub-tribes. So a group called the Apache are actually several different groups, like the Western Apache live out in modern Arizona, but a related and separate group called the Plains Apache live out in modern Oklahoma. Um, what we call the Sioux tribe in the Plains is really seven distinct different tribes that are all collectively called the Sioux. And what that means is that what we call the Comanche or the Sioux or the other tribes are usually not a single group with a single leader and a single set of rules. So, as you can see, things are already getting really complicated, right? An actual detailed version of who exactly did what and where they were is really complicated sometimes here. So, let's do an oversimplified version of that century. Here you can see the 1770s, the decade that America enters history. The land that you see over there in white has already been taken by the British in over 150 years of building the 13 colonies. And now that white land represents the settled land of the United States. That white land down in Louisiana and Texas has been settled by places like Spain and France. It's not the United States yet. As you can see, a majority of what is now the United States still belongs to the native tribes of North America. Okay, now you're going to see about 5 or 6 of these maps in a row. So if you look in the bottom left, the different colors represent the land that was ceded or surrendered to the United States in different time periods as we moved west and took more and more land. So the different colors represent land that was ceded or surrendered at a different time. So, as we started to move west after the revolution into what was called Indian territory, violence with the people who already lived there was sadly almost guaranteed. In the Great Lakes region, up kind of where you see that number one, different Algonquin speaking tribes resisted U.S. settlement. In the South, the Cherokee, the Creek, and other tribes were slowly pushed west as American settlement expanded. After the War of 1812, when Tecumseh's alliance up in the Great Lakes and the Creek down in the South were defeated, pretty much all the powerful tribes on the east side of the Mississippi River had been defeated. Tribes still lived there, but the land was essentially defenseless against continuing U.S. expansion. After that War of 1812, Americans moved even further into the West, into the lands of the Osage, into modern Arkansas and Missouri. In 1808 and 1818 and 1825, the Osage ceded or surrendered about half of their territory and agreed to move further west. In exchange for that, they were promised protection from the neighboring tribes that had often attacked them, and they got a guarantee that the U.S. government would no longer allow more settlement on their land without permission. And of course, all of those deals were broken. All of those treaties were broken. Where you see that yellow line down in Texas, the long and brutal wars against the Comanche tribes are beginning during this time period. And of course, as you'll recall, gold was discovered on Cherokee land in Georgia. You'll recall the 1830 Indian Removal Act, the Supreme Court's decision to support the Cherokee, and the infamous Trail of Tears. Up in the Midwest and the Great Lakes region, Americans continued to move into land that was inhabited by those Algonquin speaking tribes and that united around Tecumseh. And up in modern Illinois, the United States begins to move into the land that was owned by the Sauk and the Winnebago and the Illinois. Those tribes were also forced to move west, if you're remembering that theme of forcing the tribes to move west. As you've already probably gotten tired of hearing me say, within 20 years of the Indian Removal Act, the tribes on the east side of the Mississippi River were marched onto Western reservations. The completion of Manifest Destiny in the 1840s and the discovery of gold in California brought a giant wave of Americans deep into the West. And by 1850, Americans were flooding deep into the West, resulting in minor wars that very few of us actually remember today. In the minds of many Americans, the Indian Wars of this era were typified by the fearsome fighting against the Apache and Comanche in Texas and Arizona. Now, while this period seems pretty busy when you look at the list and when you look at the map, none of these wars really resulted in massive battles that are remembered today. Some of them were over after one or two very short battles, while others involved only minor engagements. This period kind of left the Americans with the belief that Native Americans stood no real threat to the US military and that any fighting between us and them would ultimately just be guaranteed to result in US victory. But in the next decades, we encountered the most difficult challenges as we moved west. This map shows you the time period of the Civil War and Reconstruction. Now, during the Civil War, multiple wars erupted out in the West. Many tribes in many areas realized the immediate threat to their lands and united to to defend certain areas. The Civil War resulted in a huge and rapid increase in the size of the US military and the power of the military and the aggression of the US military. And when the Civil War was over, all those changes combined with our old desire to settle the entire frontier, the final wave of what we called the Indian Wars raged on through those 12 years of Reconstruction. Finally came to an end with the final surrender of the Sioux in 1787. And after that, the wars and the conquest of the West were effectively over. Now, this is the time period that we haven't really heard very much about yet. I'm going to be spending some more time on this time period during class and during Pride time. This is the most famous or maybe most infamous period of the Indian Wars, and the one that always appears in the movies and the books that created our modern image of what these wars looked like. These were the biggest battles against the strongest tribes, involving the bloodiest massacres on both sides. But I'm trying to do a little summary here, so I'm just going to go ahead and move on. Again, more on this time period in class. As you can see here in the 1880s, during after the decade of Reconstruction, the final chunks of land were taken after the Apache and the Comanche and the Navajo finally surrendered in the Southwest. As we heard before, the surrenders in 1787. After that, there were really no effective resistance or large battles against American expansion. In 1886, the surrender of Geronimo was the final surrender of a Native American war chief against the United States. In 1890, this was maybe on the test and a very important date, in 1890, the government declared that the frontier was closed. All the land claimed by the United States had now been settled by Americans. There were still small pockets of tiny surviving tribes still living hidden in the deserts and mountains of the Southwest or up in the forest valleys of the northern Rockies. Still, though, by 1890, over 99% of the Native American population now lived on reservations, and the tiny groups that remained hidden and free were going to be the final generations to do so. Here you can see all the Native American tribes that exist, all the Native American reservations that exist today. And if you actually want to see this in detail, it's very easy to find this map in a Google search. It's a huge image, and you can really zoom in and read all the little tiny words there if you want to. And if you want to pause here, you can basically see all those little maps next to each other. You can pause and read it for a second if you want to. This is probably worth pausing on in class. I'll leave you here to pause the video and think about what you see here for just a second. These are just some of the basics to keep in mind when we say the Indian Wars. We need to remember that doesn't describe one thing. It's a term used to simplify dozens of extremely complicated conflicts and stories. Again, a little bit more on this in class. Hopefully, you're going to pause and examine it here. And as a reminder, getting to the end of this one here, as a reminder of something you've already heard, while these wars do involve extremely graphic and disgusting levels of violence, diseases like smallpox or measles or fevers and flus killed an estimated 85 to 95% of the indigenous people on the continent. The peoples of Europe and Asia and Africa had developed some ability to resist these deadly diseases as a result of living in close proximity with livestock and domesticated animals over hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of generations. The immune systems of Native Americans, though, had no resistance to these diseases, and the different tribes experienced different pandemics, far more devastating than Europe's Black Plague of the 1300s. As I've said before, that doesn't justify any of the massacres or broken treaties or mistreatment that's still going to occur on the reservations. This is just an important part of the story to keep in mind. Remember, the bottom of this complicated timeline shows some of those Indian wars represented in thin bars. And now maybe you've got a better understanding and a little bit more context to get why it's so hard to turn that all into one story. But actually, in the second half of this episode, I'm going to pick out one tribe and do a little summary that I think represents the era pretty well. We're going to be talking about the Sioux Wars and what happens with them and directly after them. In the continuation of what is still going to be episode 1 in this season. I hope you're enjoying it so far. Thanks a lot.